This is a very exciting occasion. As has been said 2 or 3 times by now, I am here as the first dean of the New Wadu Business School, created by Chairman Chen Fashu last year. And our goal, mine and that of the executive dean, Professor Ji Yi-he, is to bring the business school to the highest possible level. And the collaboration agreement between the New Wadu Business School and Chenji Business School is, I think, a truly important step in that direction. I thank you very much for that. And I'm also proud to say that I've been named director of the New Wadu Economics and Management Institute, which is located in Beijing. It is aimed at doing research of central importance for the development of mainland China. And so let me now start my speech. As I see it, the story of the 21st century so far is the unfolding consequences of the weakness that has come over the big 3 countries in Western Europe, and the weakness that has come over the American economy. I'll be more precise about that in a minute. Every year or two, I try to, as a macroeconomist, a practicing macroeconomist, I try to make sense of the broad movements in the world economy, and this is my latest attempt. Now, what are these weaknesses? One sign of these weaknesses is the mediocre levels of business investment expenditure in the past decade in the United States and in the big 3 of Europe. By the big 3, I mean Germany, France, and Italy. What is more striking is that these levels of business investment activity were mediocre in the past decade in spite of the unprecedented supplies of foreign saving to the West. As you know, by the West we generally mean Europe and North America. In spite of the unprecedented supplies to the West of foreign saving, which served to bring down real interest rates in Europe and America, and thus to push up asset prices to elevated levels. The West ought to have been having a boom in business investment in the past decade, but it could only manage a very subdued level of business investment. Now, a boom in residential housing investment did occur, but speculators on the demand side and bankers on the supply side created too much housing and too much leverage, leading to economic and financial collapse. In the United States, the government helped stimulate that boom. And that was also true to a degree in Europe. Now, another sign of this weakness that I perceive is the return of the productivity slowdown of the 1970s. Now, most of you were not around and studying economics in the 1970s, but that was a striking phenomenon. It seemed as if economic growth, which had been so amazing in the ever since World War II came to an end in 1945, it seemed that economic growth was going to go on at the rate of 4% forever, with output per employed person growing at about 3%. So working age population growing at 1%, giving a total of 4% growth for the gross domestic product. But what happened was, in the 1970s, is that productivity growth came to a shuddering stop, or almost. Well, then after a while, we forgot about the productivity slowdown. There were distractions. There was the internet boom, for example. It seemed as if innovation was back and productivity, it seemed that productivity was back too. But over the past decade, from 2000 until even just up to 2007, the rate of growth of productivity, output per worker, is something like 2% per annum. Probably less. I confess I didn't look up the number. That's a far cry from the 3% rate in the 1960s and the 1950s. Now, in Europe, among the big three, Italy has suffered terribly slow growth of productivity in the past decade. And not one of the big three had a growth rate in the past decade such as like the growth rate that it had in the 1960s. So I think it's fair to say that the United States is not in the early stage of a business recovery of some standard sort. But instead, the United States is in the midst of a long structural slump. And I think this slump goes back to the 1970s, really. Now, what is going on there? Well, by the 1980s, the baby boomers who were born between 1945 and 1960, by the 1980s, almost all the baby boomers had completed their entrance into the labor force. So we were no longer, the United States was no longer getting rapid growth of the working age population from the extraordinary inflows of baby boomers. That was petering out. So that's one thing. Investment activity didn't need to be as strong as before because the number of workers in the workplace was not growing as it had grown before. Another point is that in the 1970s, the overhang of unexploited commercial ideas, many of which originated way back in the 1930s with electrification in the United States, wide electrification. That pool of unexploited commercial ideas was pretty much depleted. It had been pretty much exhausted. So if there are going to be new commercial ideas after 1975 or so, if they're going to be further innovations, they would have to come from new ideas. They would have to come from ideas in the 1970s or 80s. So that's part of it. That's part of the story. Now you might say, okay, those things sound true and relevant, but hasn't the United States seen waves of innovation since the 1980s? Wasn't there an internet revolution in the second half of the 1990s and the first year or two of the last decade? And weren't there extraordinary innovations in the financial sector, such as derivatives and structured products of all kinds? Of course, we know what happened as a result of that innovation, but well, it's true that there have been a lot of there have been those two headline innovations within living memory since 1995. But most innovation is not headline innovation. Most innovation is unseen, unsung. The bulk of innovation is the summation of tiny little, barely noticeable innovations made by literally millions of people in playing active roles of one sort or another in the business sector of the economy. And there could very well have been a major slowdown in the pace of innovation of these of this unsung, unnoticed, unmeasured kind. And there's some reasons to think that innovation must have slowed. For one thing, there's the striking rise in short-termism in the business sector of the U.S. economy. The CEOs, the chief executive officers of U.S. businesses, are now strongly focused, more focused on hitting their quarterly earnings targets than they are on creating new products for 3 or 4 years ahead, or new methods of production. And then in the financial sector, nearly all the players appear to want to be in liquid assets rather than in long-term investments. In fact, is there anybody in the world who wants to hold long-term investments? I don't know. There must be some exotic sovereign wealth funds that are willing to go long in long-dated assets, but I think they're really few and far between. Stock prices, here's a peculiar piece of evidence. I just thought of it yesterday. It was based upon a discussion that I had a month or two ago. Stock prices, you notice that in the United States, the stock prices seem to go up and down so dramatically with changes in quarterly earnings. It's almost as if the people on Wall Street look at the quarterly earnings and multiply it by a constant. So whatever happens to quarterly earnings, that determines share prices. Well, I found this an astonishing development. Share prices are supposed to be all about the future. They're supposed to represent anticipations, such as they are, but they're supposed to represent anticipations of what the company is going to be worth 3, 4, 5, 6 years into the future. And those prospects may have little or nothing to do with earnings in the current quarter, or expected or promised earnings in the next quarter. So that suggests that nobody's thinking about long-term prospects, that just the whole concept of the long-term has disappeared from thinking in the financial sector and among households too. And then finally, in this little sermon or diatribe about short-termism, there are the venture capitalists, the venture capital industry. But they demand that their portfolio companies obtain profits pretty early. And the venture capitalists also demand the payment of very high interest rates, which actually jeopardizes the possibility that the company will ever live long enough to reach the long term. Then there's another factor operating, I think, that tilts calculations in favor of, or tilts calculations against investing for the long term, and that is that business persons fear that future profits are going to be taxed more heavily than present profits are. So you don't get much of a benefit from the deductibility of an investment because the rate of tax on corporate profits is not very high anyway. And you're afraid that corporate profits taxes might be doubled, might be twice as high 10 years from now, which is a possibility. So that tilts very much against making long-term investments. So in view of all this short-termism, it would not come as a surprise if we find, upon measuring as well as we can, it would not be surprising if we find that the rate of innovation, carefully measured, is down compared with the 1960s and even in the 1970s. And if that's right, then that means that one of the things sustaining business investment is not there anymore, or is not there to the same extent anymore. Now, I've been talking as if the rate of innovation is some unidimensional, one-dimension thing. And you could, if only it were observable, you could measure it with a yardstick. But of course, it's multidimensional. And so another possible explanation of, or another force behind weak business investment and weak employment is the possibility that the innovations we are getting are not reducing the cost of producing consumer goods, such as the creation of a more powerful capital good would do, a capital good producing consumer goods. Instead, it could be that there's been a shift in the direction or the character of innovation, so that now the innovations we are getting are reducing the cost of producing capital goods. But that throws workers out of work, because capital goods are very labor intensive. And it drives down the real price of capital goods, which causes businesses to want to, which causes producers of capital goods to want to, that kind of wipes out the benefit of the reduced cost. So it could be that labor is suffering from Schumpeter's creative destruction to an abnormal extent in recent years. Now, this is not just a mathematical possibility that I reached for. I do have the impression that so much of the extraordinary technological gains that we hear about are coming about not from building new houses that are better weatherproofed, or building new commercial structures that provide better insulation, or one thing or another. They all come from cutting the costs of the processes that produce computer chips, or things like that. Well, okay, well, if in fact we have this slowdown, then, and we have this weak business investment, then that's in the US and in Europe, that's going to lead to a weak dollar and a weak euro in terms of Asian currencies. In other words, it's going to lead to weak real exchange rates in the West, which is synonymous with saying strong real exchange rates in the East, in Asia. Now, the emergence of that shift of real exchange rates will gradually draw customers from the East to the West. And this shift will not go on forever because, I'm sorry, we're not going to get a progressive real exchange rate depreciation. The dollar and the euro are not going to go on falling and falling and falling and falling. As the United States, for example, gains more and more customers back from Asia, that will put a floor on the real exchange rate. Now, this real exchange rate appreciation in Asia will, of course, cause people in Asia to shift their expenditures from foreign goods, which they have been buying with a very favorable exchange rate, to buying fewer imports and instead shifting to domestic goods. Now, and of course in the United States and in the big three in Europe, this shift from big trade deficits to reduced trade deficits means that there's going to be lower global interest rates in the global economy. It means that the United States and Western Europe, which wasn't doing so much saving before, is now going to be doing increased saving. That's an addition to the world's supply of saving, and it's going to drive down world real interest rates. Now, this shift of the trade deficit, this reduction of the trade deficit in the United States and the emergence of a trade deficit and the emergence of trade surpluses in Europe will also, of course, bring a rush of capital inflow back into China and Asia generally, and we've seen that also in Brazil. And this development, in turn, drives up share prices and property prices in Asia, as well as Brazil, which is good for investment activity of a certain kind in China and Brazil, and indeed the whole world. But this increase in the supply of global saving also drives up commodity prices. And for many producers, the increase in commodity prices is a supply shock that contracts the amount of output that they're willing to supply. And that means a contraction of employment, leaving aside what adjustment mechanisms might follow from that. So as I've noted before, one effect is that in China and Asia generally is that there's now with real exchange rate appreciation, the other side of the coin of real exchange rate depreciation in the US and Europe, as a result of the real exchange rate appreciation, part nominal exchange rate appreciation and part rise of wages and prices, Asia and China will suffer a loss of their export base. Customers will be drifting from east to west. And as that happens, output and employment will fall relative to the old trend path, while just the opposite is happening, of course, in the United States and Europe. There'll be some partial recovery of output and employment relative to historical trend paths. So that would seem like that's a standard thing to say, I suppose, about Asia, that, Asia is going to be hurt by the real exchange rate depreciation in the West that comes from these weaknesses in the West that I've been talking about. But there is a kind of silver lining here. In the medium-term future, the real exchange rate appreciation in China and wherever it occurs in Asia has a structural effect serving to induce Asian producers to trim their price markups. And I'll explain that in a second. And that structural effect, narrowing the price-wage markup, the markup of price over wage, that structural effect serves to increase the output that Asian firms are willing to supply. And that effort and that effect operates to increase output and employment in Asia. Now, I want to make a few more observations about recent developments. You might say, well, that's a very bleak portrait of the West. For 200 years now, the West has always come bouncing back from one crisis after another. Why not? Why should we think that it will be any different this time? Why is it different this time? Or why should we expect that it's different this time? Well, it's very difficult for the government to find anything it can do that would bring the economy back to a normal operating level, that would achieve a full recovery from this long slump. A number of governments took initiatives in the past 10 or 12 years in an effort to stimulate the economy, but these efforts were very ill-chosen, and they resulted in huge increases in the public debt and huge increases in entitlement commitments to future generations, which didn't do much for output and employment. In some cases, they contributed to the 2007-2008 crisis, and now these measures have nothing to show. They've not helped at all. They've only made things worse by creating the increased public debt and the increased entitlements. For example, in 2002, faced with the serious recession, President Bush extended the entitlements offered under the Medicare program so as to cover the costs of medicine, not just hospitalization and doctor's visits. Well, of course, that's a fine thing to do if the economy is booming and the government is rolling in tax revenue and there's nothing to do with the revenue that has any great value, then it might be a nice thing to do. But that wasn't the case. The United States was already in fiscal difficulties owing to the already enormous mountain of entitlements coming up in the year 2020. Then, 3 or 4 years later, the Bush administration embarked on, and the US Congress, both parties, embarked on an expansion of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the institutions that help with the financing of mortgage loans on houses. And that helped fuel the flames of the housing boom, but it didn't do anything for business investment and normal investment activity, and the whole thing led to excess housing and excess leverage and impaired financial sector and a moribund construction industry. And then the Obama administration most recently decided to carry out another step in the corporatist philosophy and increase the coverage of Medicare to persons who were previously not insured under Medicare. And that probably has added another $1 trillion or something like that to the government's public debt and entitlements. Well, now, but again, it does absolutely nothing to raise employment or output or productivity or investment or anything. So now we're stuck. We've shot all our arrows into the air. They didn't go anywhere, and now we have our fiscal powers are depleted, and so we don't have now the revenue that would encourage us to embark on a reasonable program such as low-wage employment subsidies to companies for their ongoing employment of low-wage workers. That would work. That would raise employment. Singapore did that in February 2009, as you probably know, and it had a miraculous effect. They expected the unemployment rate to be going from something like 3% to 9%, and after 12 months, the unemployment rate was actually lower than it had been in February 2009. It was just like a miracle drug. If you pay employers to hang on to employees, they'll hang on to the employees. You don't need to be an Einstein to raise employment. But now we can't afford that in the West. Well, what does this have to do with China? I think the answer is it's not good news, but it's not nearly as consequential as it might have been 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. China is surely moving toward being less export dependent and more dependent on domestic investment activity, and dependence on a high level of domestic investment activity means in turn that China will have to do more to step up its rate of indigenous innovation. But there's no reason to think that China will not want to do that, and I don't think there are weighty reasons to think that it will fail in that effort. So I think we can look forward to a Chinese economy 10 years from now that is much more independent, so to speak, economically of the West, and it will be moving satisfactorily toward a level of economic performance in terms of productivity and employment that is comparable to the United States economy in its best days. Thank you very much.
谢谢 Dr. Phelps. Thank you once again, Dr. Edmund Phelps.